The sun rose pale over a field of mud and bamboo fences. Beyond the barbed wire, skeletal men stood in formation, motionless, except for the trembling in their knees. Their uniforms were long gone. Only scraps of khaki clung to their thin frames. The guards laughed, the sharp sound of bamboo canes slapping against their palms echoing through the camp. "Faster!" they shouted, though no one could move any faster. The prisoners carried heavy sacks of rice, their bare feet sinking into the wet earth. Every stumble was met with another blow. Yet somewhere behind the blank eyes and hollow faces, a pulse of quiet defiance still beat. They had seen too much: the fall of Bataan, the march through death, and now, the slow fading in captivity. But beneath the humiliation, something remained unbroken. When the guards laughed, the prisoners stared straight ahead, waiting, not for pity, not for mercy, but for the day the laughter would stop. And soon it would, because far beyond the walls of Covenant One, a whisper had begun to move through the jungle, a whisper that said, "They're coming!" In the first months of 1942, the Pacific was burning. Pearl Harbor had been struck, and Japan's empire expanded across the ocean with astonishing speed. The American and Filipino defenders of the Philippines, outnumbered, undersupplied, and cut off from reinforcements, were fighting a war already lost. For weeks, U.S. and Filipino troops held their ground on the Bataan Peninsula, digging into the jungle hills with little more than rusted rifles and half-empty ammunition belts. By April, starvation had become the real enemy. Soldiers boiled rice mixed with mud. Quinine was gone, malaria rampant. Men collapsed in their foxholes, unable to stand. When the Japanese finally broke through the American lines, surrender was the only option left. On April 9, 1942, more than 75,000 soldiers laid down their weapons, the largest surrender in American military history. But for the captors, this act of surrender was not honorable. In the Japanese code of Bushido, to be captured was to lose one's soul. And so, to them, these men were not soldiers. They were cowards. What followed was one of the darkest marches in modern warfare. The Bataan Death March stretched over 60 brutal miles from Mariveles to San Fernando. The sun scorched the road as tens of thousands of prisoners were forced to walk without food, without water, under the eyes of guards who saw them as less than human. Those who stumbled were beaten, bayoneted, or shot where they fell. Bodies lined the roadside. Filipino civilians risked their lives to toss fruit or water toward the prisoners. Many were executed for doing so. Survivors spoke later of the smell of blood, the flies, the dust that turned to mud when mixed with sweat. It was not a march. It was an execution in motion. When the columns finally reached their destinations, only a fraction remained alive. They were herded into boxcars so small that hundreds suffocated during the journey. Those who survived were taken to newly established camps, Covenant One, Davao O'Donnell, each a place built not just to contain but to break. The Japanese camp system was designed with precision and cruelty. Barbed wire perimeters enclosed rows of thatched huts, each crammed with men lying shoulder to shoulder. Food was a handful of rice and watery soup. Disease spread faster than punishment. Cholera, dysentery, and malaria were constant. Every morning, the guards conducted roll call, tenko, often lasting for hours under sun. Men too weak to stand were dragged from their huts. Those caught stealing a potato or whispering in English were beaten to unconsciousness. Punishment was public, deliberate, and meant to remind all who watched that they no longer belonged to themselves. Yet, even in this world of deprivation, the prisoners built small systems of survival. They shared medicine, hid scraps of food, whispered jokes about home. Some traded trinkets with sympathetic guards. Others memorized the names of the dead to tell families later. In the midst of cruelty, fragments of humanity persisted. The guards' laughter, cruel, sharp mocking, echoed daily through the camp. They laughed when prisoners stumbled during forced labor, when they saluted clumsily, when they salivated over a grain of rice. For the Japanese overseers, this was domination complete. But the prisoners had learned something the guards did not understand. That laughter could not kill the will to live. And slowly, over months, that will began to turn into something else, a quiet resistance. It began with secret signals, hidden notes, stolen supplies. With every passing week, the POWs began to organize, not openly, not with weapons, but with unity. The guards saw only frail bodies. They didn't see the minds that refused to yield. As the war outside the fences raged across the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Saipan, rumors began to reach the camps. The Americans were returning. The laughter of the guards grew louder, almost forced, as if to drown out the sound of that distant hope. But deep down, everyone knew the tide of war was shifting. And in places like Cabanatuan, the prisoners began to prepare for the moment when they might fight back or be freed. By late 1943, the rhythm of life in the Japanese prison camps had become a slow march of endurance. Every dawn began the same way. The sharp clang of a metal pipe against bamboo, the bark of guards shouting "Tenko" as prisoners scrambled to line up in the dirt. Many had long forgotten what day it was. Some scratched calendars on wooden beams or marked notches in the earth. The routine was cruelly simple. Roll call, forced labor, punishment, silence. In Cabanatuan Camp No. 1, the largest in the Philippines, over 8,000 prisoners once lay crammed behind its fences. By 1944, fewer than half remained alive. The dead were buried just beyond the perimeter, their graves marked with sticks or tin scraps, when they were marked at all. Food was the weapon that ruled the camp. Each man received a rice ball the size of a fist and a cup of watery vegetable soup. Starvation shrank their bodies until their ribs protruded like prison bars. Men dreamed of food constantly: steaks, potatoes, cold milk. Some whisper recipes to one another as a way to stay sane. But hunger wasn't the only torment. Disease tore through the barracks: malaria, diphtheria, dysentery. The smell of sickness hung in the air. The Japanese guards offered no medicine, but sometimes Filipino civilians or secretly sympathetic Japanese medics smuggled in quinine and bandages. Those who survived learned to adapt. They built bamboo splints for the wounded. They fashioned utensils from scrap metal. They whispered in code, short phrases, double meanings, because open talk could mean death. And still, the guards laughed. They laughed when prisoners stumbled under the weight of logs during work details. They laughed when a man collapsed in the mud, and the others tried to help. To them, these captives were living proof of Japanese superiority. The laughter became a ritual, a way to mask fear, to remind themselves of power. But something was changing beyond the camp's bamboo walls. By mid-1944, the war that had once seemed unstoppable for Japan had begun to crumble. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June had turned into what the Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were destroyed, their naval air power shattered. American submarines prowled the Pacific, cutting supply lines that once fed the Imperial Army. For the first time, the Japanese garrisons in the Philippines began to feel the noose tightening. Inside Cabanatuan, whispers of Allied victories spread like wildfire. A guard dropped a hint. A Filipino laborer passed a coded message. A distant explosion could sometimes be heard at night, proof that the war was drawing closer. The prisoner began to sense something new in the air, a mixture of fear and hope. As conditions worsened, Japanese discipline grew erratic. Some guards, realizing the war might be lost, turned more violent, fearing retribution. Others began to soften, offering small mercies or pretending not to notice the secret trade between prisoners and civilians. In this chaos, the POWs began to rebuild something more powerful than strength: organization. A few officers quietly established what they called chain of command morale. They ensured every prisoner had a role: one man to track supplies, another to keep records of the dead, others to plan for possible escape. They created secret signals: a cough, a phrase, a gesture, to warn of approaching guards. Information became the most precious resource. A smuggled radio, built from stolen parts, was hidden in a bamboo post. From it, the men learned that General Douglas MacArthur had fulfilled his promise: "I shall return." The U.S. Army was advancing through Leyte, pushing steadily toward Luzon. That news changed everything. The laughter of the guard began to sound nervous now. They beat the prisoners more savagely, suspecting collaboration. Executions became common. At the same time, orders from Tokyo demanded that no prisoners be left alive if the camps were to fall into enemy hands. The prisoners knew what that meant. They had to act or die waiting, and so began a silent war within the wire. Medicines were hidden beneath floorboards. Maps were drawn in charcoal. Filipino resistance fighters slipped through the jungle to make contact with men inside the camp. Together, they began to plan. It was no longer only about surviving each day. It was about being ready for the moment the Allies would come. The Japanese guards continued to laugh at their captives, unaware that in the shadows, their prisoners were preparing to defy them. And by early 1945, that defiance would erupt into one of the most daring rescues in modern military history. To the outside world, the prisoners of Cabanatuan were ghosts, presumed lost, forgotten by their country. But inside the camp, the human spirit refused to die quietly. Each man had his own war to fight. For some, it was against starvation. For others, against despair. They found strength in fragments, in humor, in prayer, in friendship. A few words from home, scratched on the back of a Red Cross form, could keep a man alive for weeks. When one prisoner fell ill, others shared what little food they had. The camaraderie became a shield stronger than bamboo walls. There were men like Captain Henry T.G. Lee, who wrote secret poems on scraps of paper before he died of disease, and Major Robert Lapham, who escaped and later led guerrilla units in the jungles. Each story reflected a truth the guards could not see, that faith and fraternity were more powerful than the bayonet. The Japanese could control their bodies, but never their will. And though every morning began with the sound of shouting and laughter, every night ended with whispered prayers and quiet promises that if anyone survived, the world would know what happened here. To understand the cruelty of the camps, one must understand the men who ran them. Most Japanese guards were not sadists by nature. They were products of a military culture that had stripped away empathy. From the time they were boys, Japanese soldiers were taught that surrender was shameful and that mercy toward enemies was weakness. Under Bushido code, death was preferable to capture. Therefore, to guard men who had surrendered was itself dishonorable. Many of these guards were low-ranking soldiers, assigned to prison duty as punishment or disgrace. Their resentment festered. Propaganda told them that Americans were decadent and soft, undeserving of respect. The laughter that echoed through Cabanatuan was not only cruelty. It was a way to mask fear, to assert dominance in a war that was beginning to turn against them. When prisoners refused to die quickly, it unsettled them. When they saw men enduring starvation without begging or helping one another under torture, it confused them. In their eyes, this was impossible. To the Japanese guard, laughter became a weapon and a shield. But it was also the sound of something deeper, denial. Because even as they laughed, many knew the truth. Japan's empire was faltering. Unlike the battlefields of Europe, there were no tanks, no artillery, no machines in the camps. The tools of control were primitive and terrifyingly effective. A bamboo cane, a rifle butt, the ration bowl. Punishment came not only from violence, but from deprivation. Guards learned how to measure control by hunger. Give a man just enough to work, never enough to think. Every object became part of survival. Prisoners crafted needles from wire, cups from tin cans, tools from old nails. Some learned to boil water through sunlight using broken glass. Resourcefulness became rebellion. Even information was a weapon. Radios were forbidden, yet one was secretly built from scavenged wire, a broken headset, and bits of scrap metal. The voice of freedom, as the prisoners called it, became their lifeline. Each whispered broadcast from Allied radio brought not despair, but power, the knowledge that the world outside still existed. In the jungle beyond, Filipino resistance fighters used similar ingenuity, carving bamboo rifles to train recruits, passing coded messages on cigarette paper, smuggling medicine in hollowed-out shoes. It was a war fought not with technology, but with wit and willpower. Inside the camp, survival itself was innovation. War strips away illusion. In the camps, the idea of honor, one celebrated by both sides, was reduced to ash. For the Japanese, Bushido had been twisted into obedience without compassion. For the prisoners, honor became something else entirely. The act of surviving without losing one's humanity. The guards believed they were superior because they had not surrendered. Yet their actions, beating the sick, starving the weak, mocking the dying, revealed a deeper decay. The laughter that filled Cabanatuan was not the laughter of strength. It was the laughter of men trying to convince themselves they were right. For the Americans and Filipinos inside, dignity was resistance. When a man shared his last spoon of rice, when another covered a dying friend with his only blanket, that was honor reborn. It was not the battlefield's kind of honor, wrapped in medals and glory, but the quiet, defiant kind that could exist only in suffering. Years later, survivors would say that they didn't fight to live. They lived so others could fight, in a place where life was meant to be worthless. Every act of compassion became a strike against cruelty. And in that moral collapse, one truth emerged. The strength of a nation is not measured by conquest, but by conscience. Even within the walls of captivity, strategy existed. It had to. By 1944, the prisoners had built an invisible network, a system of leadership and silent coordination that the Japanese never truly understood. Former officers of the U.S. Army quietly restored chain of command, dividing the camp into small groups. Each had a messenger, a lookout, and a man responsible for maintaining order when guards weren't watching. Information was their most precious weapon. Through bribed laborers and sympathetic locals, the prisoners learned about the progress of the war, that American forces had landed at Leyte in October 1944 and were advancing fast. Guards noticed a change in atmosphere. The men they once mocked now moved with subtle confidence. They began cleaning their huts, hiding essentials, preparing makeshift stretchers. At night, whispers filled the barracks about possible rescues, about guerrillas in the jungle, about the strange silence of Japanese patrols beyond the wire. The guards tried to tighten control, but the structure was already weakening. Some guards deserted their posts to rejoin field units. Others turned alcohol and cruelty. And then, in January 1945, a rumor spread that terrified everyone inside. Tokyo had ordered that no prisoners would be left alive if the camps faced liberation. It was not a rumor. It was a documented directive. To the Americans, this meant one thing. Time was running out. The prisoners had no weapons, but they had organization. If rescue didn't come soon, they would have to attempt something impossible: revolt. The odds were hopeless, but hope had never been logical. And beyond the camp fence, in the dark jungles of Luzon, Allied scouts were already drawing their maps, counting guards, and marking targets. The plan was forming, not yet known to the prisoners, but felt in every heartbeat that refused to surrender. In early 1945, as General Douglas MacArthur's Sixth Army pushed toward Manila, American intelligence began receiving reports from Filipino guerrillas. They spoke of a vast camp near Cabanatuan, where hundreds of Allied prisoners, survivors of Bataan and Corregidor, were being held under threat of execution. The information reached Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci, commander of the U.S. 6th Ranger Battalion. His orders were simple and impossible. Infiltrate 30 miles behind enemy lines, free more than 500 prisoners, and get them out alive. The mission was codenamed Operation Cabanatuan. To execute it, Mucci selected Captain Robert Prince, a young officer known for his calm precision. He would lead 90 Rangers and 24 Alamo scouts, supported by hundreds of Filipino guerrillas under Captain Juan Pajota and Captain Eduardo Joson. Every detail had to be perfect. If the Japanese discovered their approach, the prisoners would be slaughtered before rescue could begin. In the final week of January, the Rangers began moving under the cover of night, crawling through fields of talahib grass and mud. During the day, they hid in carbow wallows, motionless for hours. Filipino villagers brought food and information, risking execution if discovered. The operation's success depended on timing and luck. Japanese reinforcements were retreating north, and columns of enemy troops were passing within miles of the camp. For the prisoners inside, the air grew heavier. They could sense that something was coming. Guards barked orders more nervously. The laughter had stopped. The jungle beyond the fence was alive with movement, unseen, unheard, but closing in. Soon, the laughter that once echoed over the camp would be drowned out by the sound of boots, gunfire, and liberation. The balance of power was about to flip, violently, decisively, forever. The jungle was alive with whispers. Under a moonless sky, nearly 100 American Rangers moved silently through the fields of Luzon. Their uniforms were dark with mud, their rifles wrapped in rags to dull the sound of metal. At their side, Filipino guerrillas crept barefoot to the tall grass, men who knew every creek, every shadow, every wind shift. They were 30 miles behind enemy lines, surrounded by thousands of Japanese troops. But ahead lay the goal, a rectangular patch of land ringed by bamboo fences and machine gun towers, Cabanatuan prison camp. Inside that fence, 513 prisoners lay sleeping on bamboo mats, unaware that salvation was only hours away. For 3 years they had endured humiliation, hunger, and loss. They had buried friends with their bare hands. They had listened to guards laugh at their weakness, mocking their broken bodies. Now, those same guards patrolled lazily in the night, confident that the prisoners could never rise, and that no one would ever come for them. But the laughter had already died in the distance, because the jungle was bringing vengeance. The Rangers halted near a muddy irrigation ditch. Captain Robert Prince whispered final orders. Watches were synchronized, 7:30 p.m. 2 men crawled ahead, scouts moving like ghosts toward the camp perimeter. In the distance, the rumble of an American P-61 Black Widow filled the air, the diversion plane. The aircraft flew low, drawing fire from Japanese guards as it weaved over camp, its engines roaring like thunder. The prisoners stirred, confused. Guards shouted, searching the skies. No one looked toward the dark grass where the Rangers were crawling forward. At 7:40 p.m., Captain Prince gave the signal. Dozens of Rangers leapt from the ditch, running low, rifles ready. Filipino guerrillas blocked a nearby road, ambushing Japanese convoys. The first gunshot cracked the air, then another. The guards, caught between confusion and panic, began to fall. Within seconds, chaos exploded. Inside the camp, the prisoners were jolted awake by gunfire and shouting. At first, they thought it was another execution. Some dove under bamboo mats. Others froze, unsure if this was real. Then came the words that shattered the nightmare. "Get down! Americans! Stay down!" It took moments to believe. Then, disbelief turned into raw adrenaline. Rangers stormed through the gates, cutting through barbed wire, firing at the guard towers. Japanese soldiers scrambled to respond, but the shock was too great. The attack had come from everywhere at once. A tower erupted in flame as a ranger tossed a grenade into the nest. Another burst through the barracks, yelling for prisoners to follow. The men inside were too weak to run. Many had walked more than a few yards in months. Some crawled on their hands, dragging each other toward freedom. Rangers lifted them, carried them on their backs, whispering, "You're going home. Buddy, you're going home." For the guards who had once laughed, there was no laughter now. Some tried to fight. Others fled into the jungle. A few, cornered near the main gate, fought to the death. The Rangers moved with precision. Every target, every building had been marked in advance. Within 20 minutes, all guard posts were neutralized. The rescue had begun, and not a single Ranger had fallen yet. Beyond the camp, the Filipino guerrillas under Captain Pajota fought like phantoms, ambushing Japanese reinforcements from the north. Machine guns chattered through the trees. Pajota's men destroyed trucks, cut off retreat routes, and held their ground against forces 10 times their size. Their stand bought precious minutes, the difference between rescue and massacre. Inside the camp, the scene was a storm of motion. Rangers carrying half-conscious prisoners, others dragging stretchers through the mud. Some men refused to leave until the wounded were safe. At 8:15 p.m., a red flare shot into the sky, the signal that the camp was secure. But the hardest part was still ahead. They now had to march the freedmen, many barely able to stand, more than 20 miles through enemy territory. One ranger looked back at the camp as it burned. The laughter that had haunted this place for 3 years was gone. In its place, the only sound was the ragged breathing of free men. The column began moving south through the darkness, Rangers at the front and rear, prisoners in the middle, guerrillas guiding them through rice paddies and jungle paths. Every rustle of leaves could mean an ambush. Every light in the distance could be death. But step by step, the prisoners walked. Some on crutches, others carried on improvised litters. One man, delirious with fever, kept repeating, "I knew you'd come." For the rescuers, there was no greater fuel. They had risked everything. And now, they carried living proof that no American soldier would be forgotten. The rescue had begun in triumph, but it would end in endurance. By the time the Rangers and liberated prisoners left Cumberland, it was past 9 p.m. The air was heavy, humid, and filled with the scent of burning wood and gunpowder. Behind them, the camp lay in ruin, the site of 3 years of torment reduced to smoke. But freedom, for the men who could barely walk, was not simple. They had 20 miles of hostile territory to cross, rivers, rice fields, and jungle trails crawling with Japanese patrols. Every step had to be measured, every breath cautious. The first miles were agony. Many prisoners collapsed from exhaustion. Others stumbled barefoot on rocks and thorns. Some cried without sound, not from pain, but from disbelief. They had survived everything, and now they were moving toward a future that seemed too distant to trust. Rangers carried the weakest on their shoulders. Filipino guerrillas scouted ahead, cutting paths through the reeds, listening for crunch of enemy boots. In the distance, artillery rumbled, the sound of MacArthur's advance drawing closer. Still, they were deep in enemy territory. A single flare or gunshot could bring hundreds of Japanese troops down upon them. As the column reached the Pampanga River, the moon broke through the clouds, casting silver light across the water. The river was wide and slow, but to the men who had not swum in years, it looked endless. Captain Prince and the Rangers formed a human chain, locking arms to guide the prisoners across. Some nearly drowned from weakness. Others clung to the Rangers' belts, gasping, coughing, whispering prayers. Halfway across, shots cracked in the distance. Everyone froze. The Filipino scouts signaled from the far bank. It was a small Japanese patrol, unaware of what was happening. The column waited, motionless, until the sounds faded. Then they moved again, quietly, methodically, every second stretching like an hour. By dawn they had crossed. Exhausted, they collapsed in a thicket of grass, breathing in silence. The sun rose over plains of Luzon, and for the first time in years, the freedmen saw the light without barbed wire. The final stand. Back at the camp's outskirts, the Japanese discovered what had happened. Reinforcements poured in, furious, disoriented, and desperate for vengeance. They found only ashes and bodies. The humiliation was unbearable. Small patrols began sweeping the countryside, searching for fugitives. One group came dangerously close to the retreating column, forcing the Rangers and guerrillas to dig in along a ridge. A short, violent firefight erupted, gunfire echoing through the fields. Rangers used their remaining grenades sparingly. Filipino marksmen picked off advancing troops with deadly precision. Within minutes, the attackers broke and fled. For the first time since the rescue began, the Rangers realized they might actually make it out alive. But time was still their enemy. The Japanese army was collapsing, yet unpredictable, still capable of sudden, brutal counterattacks. By January 31st, after nearly 20 hours on the move, the column reached friendly lines near Talavera. American tanks from the 37th Infantry Division emerged from the mist, their white stars gleaming in the sun. A shout went up, a sound no one in that column would ever forget. "Americans!" someone cried. Men began to weep, laugh, shout, or simply collapse where they stood. Rangers lowered their rifles. The prisoners, once skin and bone, half naked and trembling, reached the tanks like pilgrims reaching a shrine. They touched the steel, the stars, the hands that reached out from the hatches. Some couldn't speak. Others could only repeat one word: home. The 513 rescued prisoners were taken to field hospitals. Many were too weak to stand for long. Some died within days, their bodies unable to recover after years of starvation. But they died free, not behind wire, not beneath the guards' laughter. For the Rangers and guerrillas, the mission had been a success beyond measure. Out of nearly 120 men involved, only 2 Americans and 1 Filipino guerrilla had been killed, a miracle by any measure. The Cabanatuan raid would go down as one of the most daring rescue operations in military history. The silence after victory. That night, in a makeshift field camp, Captain Robert Prince walked among the rescued men. Some slept for the first time without fear. Others stared into the sky, as if trying to convince themselves that the stars were real. Nearby, Filipino villagers arrived with food, rice, fruit, soup. The prisoners ate in disbelief. The taste of freedom was both physical and spiritual. Lieutenant Colonel Mucci gathered his rangers, thanking the guerrillas who had made the mission possible. Without them, he said, none of us would be here. In the distance, the faint sound of artillery continued. The war was not over. But in this one pocket of Luzon, for one brief night, it felt as if the world had stopped to breathe. The laughter of the guards was gone forever, replaced by quiet, the kind of quiet only victory and loss can share. And as dawn broke over the rice fields, the rescued prisoners watched the light rise on a land they thought they would never see again. The nightmare was over, but the memory would never fade. When word of the Cabanatuan raid reached Allied headquarters, it spread faster than any official dispatch. In the jungles of Luzon, the mission had been whispered about for weeks, but now, confirmation came through coded radio. All prisoners secured. Casualties light. Mission accomplished. General Douglas MacArthur received the message just before dawn on February 1st, 1945. He reportedly paused, eyes fixed on the report in silence, before turning to the staff and saying, quietly but firmly, "The Americans are back." The statement was more than pride. It was prophecy. The liberation of 513 prisoners from one of the most infamous Japanese camps wasn't just a victory of arms. It was psychological, a symbolic reversal of everything that had happened since the dark spring of 1942. For the first time in nearly 3 years, the Americans had reached back into the heart of their defeat and pulled their own men out. Global reaction. When the story broke publicly weeks later, it electrified the home front. American newspapers printed the photographs of gaunt, smiling men, their faces thin but alive, under headlines like, "Rangers free 500 POWs in daring raid behind lines." For families who had waited in silence since the fall of Bataan, it was like a message from the dead. Mothers, wives, and children saw names they hadn't dared to hope for. Radio commentators spoke with tears in their voices. The operation became a turning point in morale. The war in the Pacific was far from over. Brutal battles at Iwo Jima and Okinawa still lay ahead. But the rescue at Cabanatuan reminded Americans that the tide had not just turned militarily, it had turned morally. Even in the depths of cruel war, the rescue proved that humanity and duty could still prevail. Japanese reaction and embarrassment. In Tokyo, the reaction was the opposite. When reports reached Imperial headquarters that an entire prison camp had been emptied without resistance, shock rippled through the command structure. The Japanese military prided itself on discipline, order, and control, and now, this humiliation came at the worst possible time. The Army's strength in the Philippines was collapsing under the weight of MacArthur's advance. The loss of Cabanatuan was not just tactical, it was symbolic. Japanese officers in Luzon ordered investigations. Some local guard were executed for cowardice. Others fled into the hills, joining remnants of the retreating forces. To the imperial press, the story was silenced. The camp's existence was never mentioned again in official communications. But among the surviving guards, there was quiet fear. They had seen how far the Americans were willing to go, and they understood what was coming: strategic consequences. For U.S. military planners, the success of the raid offered more than emotional triumph. It offered a new blueprint for special operations. The coordination between U.S. Rangers, Alamo Scouts, and Filipino guerrillas had demonstrated that small, highly mobile units could achieve results once thought impossible. It validated the importance of intelligence, the work of local informants, the silent civilians who risked everything to guide American troops. The rescue also proved the value of speed and precision over brute force. In later months, the lessons of Cabanatuan would shape how Allied forces conducted deep penetration missions, from Burma to the Pacific Islands. It foreshadowed the strategies that modern special forces, decades later, would build upon: the faces of survival, As the freed prisoners recovered in makeshift hospitals, doctors and nurses were stunned by what they saw. Men who weighed barely 90 pounds, skin stretched tight over bone, eyes that seemed both ancient and childlike at once. Yet many of them refused to rest. They wanted to talk, to tell what had happened inside those camps. Their testimonies would become vital evidence in post-war tribunals, documenting the systematic cruelty of Japanese prison operations. Starvation, disease, beatings, executions. But beyond the legal record, their stories carried something more powerful, the resilience of spirit. In interviews, some spoke not of hatred, but of gratitude for those who came for them. They didn't have to, one former prisoner said. They could have left us there, and no one would have blamed them, but they came anyway. That single sentence, carried through newspaper columns and radio broadcasts, captured the essence of the raid better than any statistic could. In the weeks that followed, the Philippines trembled under the full force of the American return. MacArthur's promise, "I shall return," was no longer a phrase. It was reality in motion. Luzon became a battlefield of liberation, and the Cabanatuan raid stood as a symbol of what was to come. Filipino guerrillas, inspired by the success, grew bolder. Resistance groups coordinated sabotage missions, ambushed retreating Japanese columns, and fed intelligence to advancing U.S. divisions. The story of the raid spread across villages in whispers. The Americans freed the prisoners. To the Filipino people, it was not just about Americans saving their own. It was proof that the occupation was cracking, that Japan's grip, once ironclad, could be broken. And for many guerrillas who had fought for years in isolation, it rekindled a sense of purpose. They were not forgotten, and neither was their country. The collapse of Japanese control. By March 1945, the Japanese presence in central Luzon was disintegrating. What had once been an organized army was now a scattered network of exhausted soldiers, cut off from supplies, retreating into the mountains. The Imperial Command in Manila, already crippled by constant bombings, struggled to maintain any semblance of order. When word of the Cabanatuan humiliation spread through surviving units, morale collapsed further. For Japanese officers, it was a warning that no place was truly safe, not even behind their own lines. The psychological blow was immense. The image of Japanese invincibility, already fractured by defeats in New Guinea and the Marianas, shattered completely in Luzon. In captured diaries recovered after the war, Japanese soldiers described the rescue in bitter terms. They came like ghosts and took what was ours. What was once the emperor's destiny had become a desperate attempt to survive the inevitable, the survivor's long journey. For the rescued men, freedom did not end their battle. Recovery was long, often painful. Many carried diseases, malaria, dysentery, beriberi, that would haunt them for years. Some had lost so much weight that doctors barely recognized them as soldiers. When they returned to the United States, they were greeted as heroes. Yet many struggled to speak about what had happened. Some never did. The memories of Bataan, the march, the years in captivity, they were wounds that never fully healed. But among them were bonds that time could not erase. Each year after the war, survivors of the raid and the rangers who rescued them would reunite. Quiet gatherings where laughter mixed with tears. One ranger, recalling the night of the rescue decades later, said simply, "We didn't rescue heroes. We rescued brothers." The fate of the rangers and guerrillas. Colonel Henry Mucci, the mission's commander, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Captain Robert Prince, the architect of the ground plan, received the Distinguished Service Medal. Several Filipino guerrilla leaders were decorated by both U.S. and Philippine commands, though many would later fade into anonymity after the war. Their contribution, however, was incalculable. Without the guidance of local farmers and scouts who knew every bend of the Pampanga River, the raid could never have succeeded. The operation became a symbol of what could be achieved when trust bridged two nations. In post-war Manila, when the Philippines regained its independence in 1946, the memory of the shared struggle remained embedded in both people's hearts. To this day, veterans of the raid are honored not just as liberators, but as brothers in arms, a legacy written in silence. In the years that followed, books, Films and documentaries revisited the Cabanatuan One raid, some dramatized, others strictly factual. Yet the essence of the story never changed. It was not about vengeance or glory. It was about endurance, about the human capacity to hold on, even when the world had turned to darkness. At the site of the old camp, a memorial now stands. Its stone walls bear the names of those who died in captivity, and those who came for them. Visitors still come, standing quietly in the Philippine heat, listening to the wind that passes through the fields where barbed wire once stood. It is said that sometimes the local children who play near the site hear faint echoes, the sound of boots running to the night, of a whisper carried on the wind. They're coming! Not a ghost story, a memory, the sound of courage finding its way home. In every war, there are victories measured in territory, and then there are victories measured in humanity. Cabanatuan was the latter. It was not fought for land, nor for conquest. It was fought for the idea that a man's life, even one forgotten behind bamboo walls, was worth risking everything for. The men who planned the raid did not expect glory. They expected to die. Yet they went, because somewhere in the jungle, fellow soldiers still breathed, still hoped, still waited. And that was enough. The Cabanatuan raid became more than a page in military history. It became a mirror, reflecting the best and worst of what war reveals. On one side, cruelty, starvation, indifference. On the other, courage, loyalty, brotherhood. The laughter of the guards that once echoed across the camp had been replaced by silence. Not the silence of fear, but of peace. In that silence lay the dignity that the prisoners had refused to surrender, and the compassion that the rescuers had carried through the darkness. History often remembers battles by numbers. How many killed, how many saved, how many miles gained. But the story of Cabanatuan resists that arithmetic. It lives instead in smaller, quieter moments. A ranger carrying a man who could not walk. A guerrilla risking his life for soldiers he'd never met. A prisoner seeing the American flag again after years of nightmares. These were not grand gestures. They were reminders that even in war, mercy is an act of defiance. When the survivors returned home, many said they had seen the worst of humanity. But in the jungles of Luzon, they had also seen its best. And that duality, that fragile balance between horror and hope, remains the true legacy of Cabanatuan. Because in the end, it was not just a raid to free prisoners. It was a rescue of faith. The faith that in a world consumed by destruction, compassion could still be a weapon strong enough to change everything.